night I walked into that ballroom, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was a pulled hem on my dress. I was wrong. I remember standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, the one in the Rosedale house that my husband had picked out, the one that made everyone look taller than they were, and thinking I looked good. Not young, good. There's a difference, and by 41 you've made peace with that. I wore the navy wrap dress I'd bought at Holt Renfrew the previous spring, the one I'd been saving for something that felt important. My husband had texted me from the event. Come when you're ready, no rush. It's going to be a long night anyway. No rush. I've thought about those two words many times since. The firm's anniversary gala was held at the Fairmont Royal York, a Friday in November, the kind of evening where the city smells like wood smoke and the first serious cold has finally settled in, and everyone is wearing their good coats and pretending not to be tired. My husband was one of the founding partners of an architectural firm that had, over 22 years, grown into something genuinely significant. Not famous exactly, but respected. The kind of firm whose name you saw etched on the plaques of hospitals and university buildings, and that one performing arts center in Hamilton that had won a Governor General's Award the year before. I had been there for all of it. That part is important. I need you to understand that before anything else. When he started the firm with his university friend, we were living in a rented duplex in Leslieville. I was working full-time as a project manager for a property development company, and my salary was the thing that kept us fed while he built something from nothing. For the first 4 years, I handled the firm's bookkeeping on evenings and weekends because they couldn't afford an accountant. I negotiated the lease on their first real office space because I knew how to read a commercial contract and he didn't. I introduced him to the people who gave them their first 2 major contracts, a contact from my firm, a family friend of my mother's who sat on the board of a credit union that needed a new headquarters. I did all of this without thinking of it as sacrifice, because I loved him, because it was ours. By the time the firm was successful enough that my husband asked me to step back from my own career to support the business from the inside, managing their client relationships, overseeing their PR, handling the hospitality side of things that he found exhausting, I did that too. I let my own trajectory flatten out because it made sense for us. We had 2 daughters by then. Life required choices. I made mine. For 18 years, I was the person in the background of every important photograph. I organized the dinners that won the clients. I remembered the names of people's children and their anniversary dates and their food allergies. When my husband gave speeches, I had read every draft. When the firm had a difficult quarter, I was the one sitting at the kitchen table with him at midnight going through the options. None of that showed up on a business card. That night at the Fairmont, I took a cab because my husband had the car. The lobby was already full when I arrived. Architects and engineers and city councilors and clients from across the GTA. People in suits and cocktail dresses. The particular energy of a room full of people who want to be seen being in a good room. I knew most of them. I'd met almost all of them at one point or another, through dinners or client events or the firm's annual summer party at our cottage in Muskoka. A few people smiled and nodded as I made my way through the crowd. The kind of smile you give someone you half recognize. I found my husband near the bar. He was standing with his business partner, the man who had co-founded the firm with him, who I had always found charming in the way that people are charming when they've never had to worry about being liked, and with a woman I recognized but had only met a handful of times. She was the firm's new creative director, hired about 8 months earlier from a firm in Vancouver, mid-30s. The kind of effortless that takes a lot of effort. She was laughing at something my husband had said, her hand briefly on his arm. My husband saw me approaching. Something moved across his face, too fast for me to name it at the time, though I've named it many times since. You made it, he said. That was it. No introduction. No come meet everyone. No hand at the small of my back the way he used to do in the early years when we walked into rooms together. I smiled and said hello to his partner, who kissed my cheek in the way he always did, and then I turned to say hello to the creative director. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as courteous and distant. The look you give someone who is adjacent to someone important. Great to finally see you again, I said. She said, and turned back to my husband. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I got a glass of wine. I talked to a structural engineer I'd met at the cottage 2 summers before, a kind man who asked after my daughters. I talked to a client's wife, who I'd taken to the AGO for a members' opening the previous spring. I was doing what I always did at these events, holding up a wall of warmth and keeping things running smoothly. Invisible labor that everyone benefits from and no one credits. Around 9 o'clock, the speeches began. My husband spoke last. He talked about the firm's origins. Our origins, though he didn't use that word. And about the 22 years of work. And the relationships built and the buildings that would outlast everyone in that room. He thanked his partner by name. He thanked several key staff members by name. He thanked their clients by category. He did not mention me. I stood near the back and held my wine glass and told myself it was an oversight. He was nervous about public speaking. He always forgot things. I would tease him about it later in the car on the way home, and he would groan and say he couldn't believe he forgot, and we would laugh. That's what I told myself. Afterward, I went looking for him. I found him near the windows overlooking Front Street, the lights of the city laid out below. He was standing very close to the creative director, closer than colleagues stand. I stopped. She said something to him quietly. He reached up and touched her face. Just for a second, a thumb across her cheek, and then they both seemed to feel something shift in the room and looked up. He saw me. She saw me. My husband took a small step back. He opened his mouth. What he said was, "It's not what you think." I've heard those words before. Everyone has. You see them in movies and think no one would ever actually say them in real life, that they were invented by screenwriters as a shorthand for a certain kind of moment. But people do say them, because when you're standing in the rubble of something you thought was solid, sometimes all you can do is reach for the most available phrase. "How long?" I said. My voice came out very quiet. "Can we not do this here? How long?" He looked at the floor. She had the decency to take several steps away, but not enough decency to leave entirely. "About a year," he said. A year. I had spent that year buying Christmas presents for both our daughters, managing a bathroom renovation, attending the funeral of his mother, organizing a retirement dinner for a client who had been with the firm for 15 years, negotiating a supplier contract on behalf of the business, and supporting my husband through what he described as the most stressful professional period of his career. A year. I didn't cry. I want to tell you something broke open in me in that moment, but the truth is, it didn't. Or rather, what broke open was something cold and very clear. I felt suddenly extremely sober. The way you feel right before something important happens. "Okay," I said. "Okay." He looked confused. "Okay," I said again. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." I picked up my coat from the coat check, walked through the lobby of the Fairmont, and stepped out onto Front Street. It was cold. The kind of November cold that has teeth. I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes without my phone, without a plan, just breathing. Then I got in a cab and went home. I want to be precise about what happened in the next 4 days, because people have this idea that when a woman does what I did, it must have been impulsive, emotional, a reaction. But I'd had a year of half-noticed things accumulating. The late nights, the distance, the way he'd started CCing her on emails that he used to handle himself. The hotel receipt for Ottawa that I'd found in his jacket pocket in March when I was taking it to the dry cleaners. I had spent several of those months quietly, calmly, preparing. My sister is a family lawyer in Mississauga. She had drawn up the papers 3 months earlier. I had my own bank account, my name only, funded from a portion of my own consulting income that I'd been quietly redirecting for 8 months. I had spent 2 Saturday mornings at our financial advisor's office reviewing the firm's corporate structure and understanding exactly what my 30% ownership stake was worth. 30%, because my name had been on the original shareholder agreement, because my husband's partner had insisted on it at the time, had said it was the right thing to do, had poured whiskey for all 3 of us and called it the beginning of something real. My 30% stake was worth approximately $2.3 million at the last formal valuation. On the Saturday after the gala, while my husband was at the office, or wherever he actually was, I called my financial advisor, my sister, and the corporate lawyer I had been consulting with discreetly since the spring. I transferred the contents of our joint account into my personal account. It was my legal right. My name was on the account. I canceled the joint credit cards. I canceled the joint travel insurance policy that covered the trip to Portugal we had been planning for March. Then I called the independent broker I had spoken with twice before and told him I was ready to list my shares for sale. The timing was deliberate. The firm had just announced a major contract, a public-private partnership for a community health center network across 3 Ontario municipalities, the kind of project that would be in the news, the kind that raised valuations. My shares, listed at that moment, were worth considerably more than the last formal assessment. On Tuesday, I received an offer. On Wednesday morning, I accepted it. My husband found out at 11:17 on Wednesday morning. I know the exact time because I was sitting in a coffee shop in the distillery district when his name appeared on my screen. I let it ring. He called again. I let it ring again. By 12:30, he had called 11 times and sent 4 text messages, each one progressively less composed than the last. At 1 o'clock, I called my sister and told her to proceed with filing. I didn't speak to my husband directly until Thursday afternoon, when I agreed to a brief conversation by phone, not at the house, not in person. He was not calm. He wanted to know why I hadn't talked to him first. He wanted to know if I understood what this would do to the firm's stability. He used the word vindictive once, and I let him finish, and then I said, "I've been your business partner and your wife for 22 years. You've had both of those things from me. Now you have neither. I think that's fair." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't have to do it this way." "I know," I said. "But I wanted to." There's a particular freedom in saying something that is simply true. I stayed in the house for another 6 weeks while the legal process moved forward. My sister is thorough, which is what you want in a family lawyer, and then I moved into a rental condo in the East End, a high-rise overlooking the lake. My daughters came on alternating weekends. The older one was 17 and furious, mostly at her father, though she didn't know how to say that yet, and so was furious at everything for a while. The younger one was 15, and handled it by becoming very quiet and very focused on her rowing team, which is actually a pretty healthy response when you think about it. I didn't push either of them. The sale of my shares completed in early January. After taxes and legal fees, I had just over $1.8 million, more than I had earned in the previous 12 years combined, which tells you something about how a long marriage can quietly rearrange your sense of what you're worth economically. I also received a settlement that accounted for my years of direct contribution to the firm's growth, a fact that was not contested given that my role and my contributions were documented across 20 years of board minutes and correspondence. My sister had been very thorough in that respect too. I want to be careful here not to make this sound like a triumph exactly. There were nights in that condo when I would stand at the window watching the lights on the lake and feel the specific grief of a life that didn't turn out the shape you expected. I'd loved my husband. That part was real. The years were real. Waking up and rebuilding your sense of who you are at 41 when you thought you already knew. That's not a montage. It's slow. It's quiet. It requires a lot of very boring bravery. But there was also this. About 4 months after I moved out, I ran into my husband's business partner at a conference downtown, a design and urban planning event I had been attending annually for years. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, the way people do when they're not sure which version of the story you're in. I shook his hand. I asked how things were going at the firm. He said things were fine. He said it carefully. I asked how the new creative director was settling into her expanded responsibilities. He looked at me. "She resigned," he said. "About 6 weeks ago." I nodded as if this were mildly interesting information. "The Portugal trip got cancelled too, I heard," he added, and then seemed to realize that was a strange thing to say. "It did," I confirmed. We stood there for a moment in the way that people do when a conversation has reached its natural end. "But neither person has moved yet. You built a lot of that firm," he said finally. Not an apology. But not nothing either. "I know," I said. That's why I knew what it was worth. I walked away without looking back, which is the only way to walk away from anything. I've been doing a lot of things for myself since then. I started consulting independently, properly this time, with my own clients, my own rates, my own schedule. I hired a financial planner who works exclusively with women going through major life transitions, and she's worth every cent. I booked the Portugal trip for myself and my younger daughter, who is 16 now, and who told me on the 4th evening, over a carafe of wine she was not supposed to have, but I let her share because we were on vacation in a country where no one knew us, that she was proud of me. "For what?" I asked her. "For not just being sad about it," she said. I thought about that a lot. For not just being sad about it. As if the other option, accepting a version of myself that someone else had quietly decided I was simply off the table. As if somewhere in me, underneath the navy dress and the 18 years of invisible labor and the grief I hadn't finished processing, I had always known what I was worth. Even when I'd let someone else determine the terms. I hadn't just endured it. I documented it. Prepared for it. Filed it. And then I walked out of a ballroom in November and into the rest of my life. The condo lease is up next month. I've put an offer in on a place of my own, a semi-detached in Leslieville as it happens. Not far from where we lived when everything was just beginning. I don't think that's poetic. Exactly. I think it's just where I found a good house at a price that made sense. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't smile a little when I signed the offer. Some things you keep to yourself. Some things you keep to yourself. I've thought a lot about what my younger daughter said on that terrace in Portugal, for not just being sad about it, and what it actually means to choose something other than sadness when sadness would be the easiest, most available thing. I think the honest answer is that I didn't choose it all at once. I chose it in small increments, over months, in the quiet of early mornings when the house was still, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee I hadn't touched, running numbers on a spreadsheet that my husband didn't know existed. I chose it every time I opened a document my sister had sent and made myself read it carefully instead of closing the tab. I chose it in the parking garage after my second meeting with the corporate lawyer, when I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive, not because I was uncertain, but because I was allowing myself to fully understand what I had decided. That's the part no one talks about. The decision isn't a moment. It's a long series of quiet, unglamorous choices made by a person who has finally gotten honest with herself about what she's been pretending not to see. I had pretended not to see things for a long time. The receipt in the jacket pocket, the way he angled his phone screen away from me, the too careful explanations of where he'd been. I'm not saying I was weak for not acting sooner. I think I was doing what most people do, which is protecting a version of their life that they're not yet ready to lose. But there's a cost to that protection. You pay it in a kind of low-grade erosion of yourself. A slow shrinking of what you expect and what you ask for and what you believe you deserve. What I know now is that the actions I took, the account transfers, the share sale, the filing, weren't revenge. I want to be precise about that, because the word revenge implies something hot and reactive, something then to wound. What I did was documentation turned into action. It was 22 years of invisible contribution, finally given a dollar figure and a legal structure. It was me deciding that my work had a value whether or not my husband had ever chosen to name it. That's a moral position, not a tactical one. And I think that distinction matters. My husband's partner told me I had built a lot of that firm. He said it like a concession, like something he had to push out. But it wasn't a concession, it was just a fact. And facts don't require anyone's permission to be true. The years I spent supporting that business were real, regardless of whether they were acknowledged. The contacts I brought, the contracts I facilitated, the dinners I organized and the drafts I read and the difficult quarters I sat through, all of that existed whether or not it appeared on a title page or an org chart. Intelligence, I've come to think, is not just about what you know. It's about being honest enough with yourself to see a situation clearly even when clarity is uncomfortable. It's about preparing for outcomes you hope won't be necessary. It's about understanding that your value is not something another person grants you. It's something you either recognize in yourself or you don't. And courage, real courage, the kind that doesn't look like anything dramatic from the outside, is doing the boring, necessary, unglamorous work of protecting yourself when you finally understand that you're the only one who will. I'm not the same person who stood in front of that mirror in Rosedale, holding a glass of wine and telling herself she was reading too much into things. I am, I think, more myself than I have been in a very long time. The condo facing the lake, the consulting clients who are mine, the offer signed and a semi-detached in Leslieville where the whole thing started, where there was nothing yet and anything was still possible. Some things return you to yourself. You just have to be willing to walk out of the room first.